Imagine buying your dream farm, only to discover that the HOA president next door has been secretly plotting to steal your land. For 3 years, I fought against false documents, trespassing, and harassment, until I finally uncovered a scheme so outrageous it would make her lose everything. When I caught the HOA president taking photos of my private farm at midnight, I thought she was just being nosy. I had no idea this was just the beginning of a calculated plan to legally steal my property and force me into their control. Here's how I exposed the truth and brought down her entire operation. 3 years ago, I finally achieved what I'd been dreaming of for most of my adult life. After months of searching and saving every penny I could, I found it. The perfect escape. A small farm property that promised everything I'd been looking for: solitude, freedom, and a chance to build something truly my own. No neighbors breathing down my neck, no restrictive rules about what color I could paint my mailbox, and most importantly, no drama. Just me, a few acres of rolling fields, a beautiful tree line at the back of the property, and a rustic house that was practically begging to be restored to its former glory. The property had character, the kind you can't manufacture in those cookie-cutter suburban developments. The centerpiece was this old metal gate at the entrance, sturdy and imposing despite its age. Sure, it was a bit rusty and the padlock had seen better days, but it did its job perfectly, keeping my little slice of paradise private and secure. I remember standing at that gate the day I got the keys, looking out over my land, feeling like I'd finally found my place in the world. The first few weeks were exactly what I'd hoped for. I spent my days mapping out renovation plans for the house, clearing overgrown areas and just soaking in the peaceful atmosphere. The only sounds were birds chirping, the occasional distant tractor, and the satisfying crunch of gravel under my boots as I walked my property line. It was perfect. Or at least it was until she showed up. I'll never forget that first encounter with Karen. Not her real name, but trust me, it fits. I was unloading the last of my moving boxes, already planning where I'd plant my first vegetable garden, when I heard the distinctive sound of expensive heels on gravel. There she stood, wearing what had to be designer workout clothes, with that kind of smile that's so bright it almost hurts to look at. You know the type, all teeth and no warmth. "Hi there, neighbor." Her voice was honey sweet, but something about it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "I'm Karen, president of the Oakwood Hills HOA. She gestured vaguely toward a cluster of identical homes about half a mile away, barely visible through the trees. "We like to keep our neighborhood looking nice, so I thought I'd come introduce myself." I was polite, of course. My mama raised me right, but I made sure to establish boundaries right away. "Nice to meet you," I said, "but I'm not actually part of your HOA. My property's outside your jurisdiction." That's when I saw it. Just a flicker, but unmistakable. Her smile faltered for a split second before coming back even bigger than before. "Oh, of course, of course." She laughed, but it sounded forced. "But you know what they say. It's always good to be a good neighbor." Looking back now, I should have recognized that phrase for what it was, a warning shot across the bow. But at the time, I just chalked it up to suburban small talk. I nodded, made some vague comments about having a lot of unpacking to do, and went back to my boxes. I could feel her eyes on my back as she walked away, studying my property like she was taking mental notes. If I'd known then what I know now, about the photos she'd take, the lies she'd tell, the documents she'd forge, and the way she'd try to use the entire HOA as a weapon against me, I might have done things differently from the start. But isn't that always the way? Hindsight's 20/20, and the red flags only seem obvious once you know what you're looking for. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The real trouble didn't start until a few weeks later, when I decided to repair that old gate at the entrance to my property. That's when I learned just how far some people will go to control what isn't theirs, and how a simple, "welcome to the neighborhood," could turn into a 3-year nightmare of surveillance, sabotage, and small-town politics gone wrong. Let me tell you about the day everything changed. The day Karen brought cookies, and with them, the first real glimpse of the storm that was coming my way. The day Karen brought cookies started like any other. I was out by the front gate, covered in rust and paint, working to restore the old metal entrance to its former glory. It was therapeutic work, really. Just me, some sandpaper, and decades of neglect slowly giving way to something beautiful again. That's when I heard her car pull up. She emerged holding a plate of chocolate chip cookies wrapped in clear cellophane with a perfect little bow on top. Everything about Karen was always perfect. Her manicured nails, her precisely styled hair, her coordinated athleisure wear. But it was her smile that caught my attention this time. There was something different about it, something almost predatory. "I thought you might like a little welcome gift," she chirped, holding out the plate. I wiped my hands on my jeans and accepted them, trying to ignore the way her eyes kept darting to the gate behind me. I'd just finished applying the first coat of black paint, and honestly, it was looking pretty good. "You know," she said, gesturing toward the gate with a perfectly manicured hand, "some of the folks in our neighborhood were wondering why it's locked. It's such a shame to keep such a lovely piece of land all closed off like this." I felt my guard go up immediately. "Well, it's my private property," I replied, keeping my tone neutral but firm. "I like having my space." That's when I saw it again, that same flicker in her eyes I'd noticed during our first meeting. Her smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before snapping back into place like a rubber band. "Oh, of course, of course. I just meant that it's such a beautiful area. The kind of place people would love to take a walk or enjoy the view, you know, as good neighbors." There it was again. Good neighbors. The phrase was starting to sound less like a friendly sentiment and more like a threat. Before she left, she added something that would later prove to be far more significant than I realized at the time. "You know, if you ever want to make improvements to the property, the HOA has resources. We're always here to help." I didn't think much of it then. Karen was pushy, sure, but I figured that was just her personality. I didn't know yet that this was only the opening move in a much larger game. A few months passed quietly. I settled into a routine, spending my days working on the house, planning out my garden beds, and enjoying the solitude I'd bought this place for. Then one evening, as I was reviewing footage from my security camera, something I'd started doing habitually, I noticed something odd. There was Karen standing outside my gate at dusk. She wasn't doing anything particularly suspicious, just standing there with a clipboard, taking notes and occasionally glancing around as if to make sure no one was watching. It was strange enough to make me uncomfortable, but not quite enough to confront her about it. Not yet, anyway. That changed the following weekend. I was out back clearing some brush near the tree line when I heard voices. At first I assumed they were coming from the road, but as they got closer, I realized they were coming from inside my property. I followed the sound until I came across two strangers, a middle-aged couple I'd never seen before, walking through my field like they were on some sort of nature trail. "Excuse me," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady despite my rising anger. They jumped, clearly startled, and started stammering apologies. "Oh, I'm so sorry," the woman said, her face flushing. "Karen said it would be fine. She told us this was part of the neighborhood and that it's open to residents. We just wanted to take a look." I felt my blood pressure rising. Karen said what? The couple exchanged nervous glances. "This is private property," I continued, fighting to keep my voice level. "Karen has no authority here. Please leave." They hurried off, still apologizing, but I stood there for a long time after they left, trying to process what had just happened. Why would Karen tell people my property was part of the neighborhood? Was this some kind of misunderstanding, or was she actively trying to cause problems? The next day, I decided it was time for a confrontation. I walked over to the HOA office in the subdivision, my security camera footage ready on my phone. What I didn't know then was that I was about to uncover the first thread of a conspiracy that went far deeper than I could have imagined, one that would eventually reveal just how far some people will go to get what they want. And Karen? She was just getting started. The HOA office was exactly what you'd expect, a converted house with perfectly manicured bushes and an unnecessarily large sign proclaiming Oakwood Hills Homeowners Association. Karen greeted me with her usual smile, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes when she saw me. Nervousness, maybe. "Oh, what a nice surprise," she exclaimed, gesturing for me to sit down. Her office was a shrine to suburban conformity, walls lined with approved paint swatches and photographs of pristine lawns. "What brings you by?" I cut straight to the chase. "Want to explain why people are wandering around my property claiming you gave them permission?" I pulled out my phone, showing her the security footage. "Or why you've been taking pictures of my gate after dark?" Her smile didn't waver, but her knuckles whitened as she gripped her desk. "Oh, that must have been a misunderstanding," she said quickly. "I might have mentioned your property in passing, but I never told anyone they could go in." Her tone was dismissive, rehearsed. "And the photographs?" I pressed. "Just documenting the neighborhood for our records," she replied smoothly. "You know how it is. Keeping track of property values, maintaining community standards." That's when she dropped the bomb. "You know, if you ever want to join the HOA, we'd be happy to have you. It would make things so much simpler for everyone." The threat was barely veiled. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. "My property isn't part of your HOA, Karen. It never will be. And if I catch anyone else trespassing, I'll be calling the police." As I turned to leave, she called after me, "Just remember, good neighbors work together." I was starting to hate that phrase. That week, I installed more security cameras around my property. If Karen or her HOA cronies were going to keep pushing, I wanted evidence. It didn't take long to get it. The cameras caught Karen at my gate again just 3 nights later. This time, she wasn't alone. 2 other people were with her, all 3 huddled around what looked like blueprints, pointing and discussing something I couldn't hear. They were there for almost an hour, measuring and taking notes. Then the letter arrived. It was official HOA letterhead, complete with their pretentious little logo. The first line made my blood boil. "We've noticed that your property is not currently in compliance with HOA guidelines." I nearly laughed. Compliance? I wasn't even part of their association. But as I read on, the humor faded. They were claiming my fence was not up to community standards and demanding I remove it. They even included a timeline for compliance and threats of fines. But they made one crucial mistake. The letter was signed not just by Karen, but by the HOA's lawyer. Now I had proof that this wasn't just Karen acting alone. This was an official HOA action. I called my friend Sarah, a real estate attorney. As she read the letter over the phone, I could hear her trying not to laugh. "They can't do this," she said finally. "They have absolutely no jurisdiction over your property, but—" She paused. "The fact that they're trying is interesting. Send me everything you have, the security footage, any correspondence, everything. Something's not right here." She was right. Over the next few days, I dug deeper. I pulled out my property deed, the survey from when I bought the place, everything. That's when I found something fascinating. According to the original survey, a small strip of the HOA's decorative landscaping was actually on my property. But before I could use this information, things escalated. One morning, I woke up to find trash scattered just inside my tree line. Not random litter, but deliberately placed refuse. The next day, there were mysterious tire tracks near my back fence. Then came the final straw. Someone had walked straight through my tomato plants, crushing weeks of work. The message was clear. This was no longer just about paperwork and property lines. "They have absolutely no jurisdiction over your property, but—" She paused. "The fact that they're trying is interesting. Send me everything you have, the security footage, any correspondence, everything. Something's not right here." She was right. Over the next few days, I dug deeper. I pulled out my property deed, the survey from when I bought the place, everything. That's when I found something fascinating. According to the original survey, a small strip of the HOA's decorative landscaping was actually on my property. But before I could use this information, things escalated. One morning, I woke up to find trash scattered just inside my tree line. Not random litter, but deliberately placed refuse. The next day, there were mysterious tire tracks near my back fence. Then came the final straw. Someone had walked straight through my tomato plants, crushing weeks of work. The message was clear. This was no longer just about paperwork and property lines. This was war. What I didn't know then was that Karen had already set in motion a plan that would make these petty acts of vandalism look like child's play. She wasn't just trying to bully me into joining her HOA, she was trying to steal my land entirely. And the evidence of her master plan was about to land right in my mailbox. The envelope that changed everything arrived on a Tuesday morning. Unlike the previous HOA letter with its official letterhead and threatening tone, this one was different. Plain white, hand-delivered, with just my name written in neat cursive on the front. Inside was a petition, and what I read made my coffee go cold. We, the members of Oakwood Hills HOA, respectfully request that you reconsider your stance on allowing limited community access to your property. The document went on for several pages, filled with signatures from residents I'd never met, but it was the final paragraph that made my hands shake with anger. Furthermore, we propose the integration of said property into the existing HOA framework to ensure proper maintenance and community standards are upheld. This integration would benefit all parties involved and maintain property values throughout the extended neighborhood area. They weren't just asking for access anymore. They were trying to force my property into their HOA. The signatures covered page after page, but one stood out at the top, Karen's elaborate signature, complete with her title as HOA President. I immediately called Sarah, my attorney. As I scanned and emailed her the petition, she was unusually quiet. Finally, she spoke. This isn't just a petition. This is groundwork. They're building a paper trail. A paper trail for what? I asked, though I was starting to get a sinking feeling in my stomach. For a forced annexation, she replied grimly. It's rare, but it happens. Homeowners associations sometimes try to expand their territory by claiming adjacent properties are affecting community values. They usually need city approval, property owner consent, or proof of abandonment or neglect. Given how well you maintain your property, I'm guessing they're going for the consent angle, trying to show you're being unreasonable by refusing to work with the community. I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair, looking out over my fields through the window. The land I'd worked so hard to buy and maintain, the peace I'd fought to protect. Karen was trying to take it all away with paperwork and politics. What do we do? I asked. First, Sarah said, her voice taking on a determined edge, we need to find out exactly what they're planning. This petition isn't the whole story. Keep your cameras running, document everything, and don't sign anything, no matter what they tell you. I spent the next few days in a state of hypervigilance, watching my security feeds like a hawk. My patience paid off on Thursday night when my cameras caught something that made my blood run cold. Karen was back, but this time she had company. 2 men in suits carrying what looked like survey equipment and official documents. I zoomed in on my tablet, watching as they walked the perimeter of my property, stopping occasionally to consult their papers and point at various landmarks. They spent particular attention on the old gate and the tree line where my property met the HOA's landscaping. Thanks to my upgraded security system's audio capabilities, I could make out fragments of their conversation. City Council meeting next month. Precedent for community integration. Property values impact study. They were building their case piece by piece, and they thought they were doing it in secret. The next morning, I drove straight to the county records office. If Karen wanted to play with paperwork, I'd show her how it's done. I spent hours digging through property records, zoning documents, and historical surveys. What I found was gold. Not only was my property legally distinct from the HOA's jurisdiction, but I discovered that the decorative stone wall they'd built along their perimeter actually encroached on my land by almost 3 feet. Even better, they'd never filed the proper permits for that wall's construction. Armed with this information, I made my next move. I hired an independent surveyor to document everything: property lines, encroachments, and every single improvement I'd made to my land since purchasing it. The surveyor's report was comprehensive, including dated photographs and detailed measurements. But Karen had been busy too. That afternoon, my security cameras caught her leading a group of residents on what looked like a tour on my property. They were walking along my fields, pointing at my house, even taking pictures. The audacity was stunning. I called the police this time. When they arrived, Karen tried to play innocent, claiming they were just admiring the view from the road. But my security footage told a different story. The officers issued them all warnings for trespassing, and I made sure to get a copy of the police report. That evening, I received an email that made everything click into place. A friend who worked at City Hall had found something interesting. Karen had filed a formal request for a property assessment, claiming my land was underutilized and detrimental to community growth. She was building a case to force my hand. But her next move was something I never saw coming. The following morning, a large envelope arrived from the city council. Inside was a notice of a public hearing. Karen and the HOA had formally petitioned to have my property rezoned and incorporated into their development district. This wasn't just about property values or community access anymore. This was a calculated attempt to use local government to seize control of my land. They were trying to change the rules of the game itself. I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by documents, surveys, and police reports, and made a decision. If Karen wanted to play dirty, I'd show her what a real fight looked like. I had truth, documentation, and righteous anger on my side. But more importantly, I had something she didn't expect. A plan to expose everything. The war for my farm was about to go public, and Karen had no idea what was coming. I've always believed that sunlight is the best disinfectant. It was time to bring Karen's schemes out of the shadows and into the harsh light of day. But first, I needed to make sure my evidence was ironclad. Working with Sarah, my attorney, we compiled everything. The security footage, the false HOA violations, the trespassing incidents, the police reports, and most damning of all, the documentation of Karen's attempted land grab through city council. But we also found something else, something that would turn the entire neighborhood against her. During our investigation, we discovered that Karen had been using HOA funds to pay for her legal maneuvers against me. Every letter, every survey, every legal consultation, all paid for with the community's monthly dues. She'd been burning through their money to fund her personal vendetta, and she'd done it all without board approval. I decided to go nuclear. I created a comprehensive online post, complete with time-stamped videos, scanned documents, and a detailed timeline of events. But I didn't just post it on social media. I sent it directly to every HOA board member, every resident who'd signed her petition, and every city council member scheduled to hear her rezoning request. The title was simple, but effective. The HOA president who tried to steal my farm, a story of corruption and abuse of power. Within hours, my phone started blowing up. HOA board members were calling, horrified by what they'd discovered. Residents were messaging me, apologizing for signing the petition, explaining that Karen had told them it was just a formality for community improvement. Local news outlets were reaching out for interviews. But the most interesting call came from Dave, the HOA's vice president. His voice was shaking with anger as he spoke. "I had no idea," he said. "Karen told us she was handling a difficult neighbor situation. She never mentioned anything about trying to forcibly annex your property. And those legal fees, she told us they were for updating the HOA bylaws." Dave went on to explain that Karen had been presenting a completely different story to the board. She'd painted me as an uncooperative outsider, threatening their property values, while presenting herself as the dedicated president protecting the community's interests. "We've called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow night," Dave said. "We'd like you to attend and present your evidence in person. It's time everyone heard the truth." The meeting would turn out to be even more explosive than I anticipated. But before that could happen, Karen made one last desperate move that would seal her fate. Part 8. The Final Stand. The night before the board meeting, my security system sent an alert to my phone. Someone was at the gate. I pulled up the camera feed and couldn't believe what I was seeing. Karen, illuminated by my security lights, was attempting to remove my "no trespassing" signs with a pair of bolt cutters. This wasn't the calculated, manipulative Karen who'd been playing politics for months. This was a desperate woman watching her power slip away, making one last reckless attempt to assert control. I called the sheriff's department immediately. "I have an HOA president vandalizing my property on camera right now," I told them. "And yes, I'd like to press charges." When the deputies arrived, Karen tried to play her usual games. She claimed she was inspecting the property lines, and that the signs were in violation of community standards. But her excuses fell flat in the face of clear video evidence showing her attempting to destroy private property. The deputies were professional but firm. They reviewed the footage, took statements, and ultimately issued Karen a citation for attempted vandalism and criminal trespassing. The sight of her being escorted off my property, bold cutters confiscated as evidence, was something I'll never forget. But the real showdown came the next evening at the emergency HOA board meeting. The community center was packed. I'd never seen so many people at an HOA meeting before. Karen sat at the front, still trying to maintain her air of authority, but the cracks in her facade were showing. I presented my evidence methodically, starting with the early incidents and building up to her recent arrest. With each new revelation, the room grew tenser. When I showed the financial records proving she'd misused HOA funds, several people gasped audibly. This wasn't about community standards or property values, I concluded. This was about power and control. Karen wasn't just trying to steal my land, she was stealing from all of you to do it. The questions from residents came fast and furious. How much money had she spent? What legal exposure did the HOA face? How long had this been going on? Karen tried to defend herself, but each explanation only dug her hole deeper. Then Dave stood up and delivered the final blow. He'd done some digging of his own and discovered that Karen had attempted similar schemes in her previous neighborhood before moving here. This wasn't her first attempt at expanding HOA territory through questionable means. It was just the first time she'd been caught. The vote to remove her as president was unanimous. As she stormed out of the meeting, her perfect mask finally cracked completely. "You'll regret this," she snapped at me. "All of you will." But we wouldn't regret it. In fact, the next few weeks would prove that Karen's removal was just the beginning of the neighborhood's healing process. The city council's response to my evidence would ensure that no HOA president could ever try anything like this again. And me? I finally got what I'd wanted all along: peace and quiet on my farm. But I'd also gained something unexpected: real neighbors who understood the value of respect and boundaries. The week following Karen's removal as HOA president was a whirlwind of revelations and changes. The new interim board, led by Dave, launched a full audit of the HOA's finances, and what they found was staggering. Karen's obsession with my property had cost the association over $50,000 in legal fees, unauthorized surveys, and consulting services, all carefully hidden under vague budget line items like community improvement initiatives and legal compliance measures. But the financial damage was just the beginning. As word spread about Karen's schemes, more stories started emerging from the woodwork. 3 different residents came forward with tales of excessive fines and threats over minor infractions: a flower bed that was 2 inches too wide, a mailbox painted the wrong shade of brown, a garden gnome that violated the aesthetic standards of the community. In each case, Karen had used her position to bully and intimidate, always with that same sugary sweet smile and talk of being a good neighbor. The city council meeting, originally scheduled to hear Karen's petition for rezoning my property, turned into something entirely different. Instead of considering her request, the council members were now reviewing evidence of potential ethics violations. Karen had apparently been meeting privately with certain council members, making promises about community development and increased tax revenue if they supported her plans. One council member, visibly uncomfortable, admitted that Karen had suggested my property could be developed into a lucrative subdivision once it was under HOA control. She'd painted a picture of increased property values and tax benefits, all while conveniently omitting the fact that she had no legal right to make such proposals about land she didn't own. The council not only rejected her rezoning petition, but also implemented new guidelines requiring stricter oversight of HOA expansion requests. "What happened here," one council member stated, "is a perfect example of how these organizations can be misused when proper checks and balances aren't in place." Meanwhile, the HOA board was working overtime to repair the damage to the community's reputation. They held open meetings to discuss the changes needed in their governing structure, created new transparency requirements for all financial decisions, and even started a committee to review and revise their rulebook to prevent future abuses of power. Dave, proving to be the leader the community actually needed, made a point of personally apologizing to me. "We let one person's power trip blind us to what was really happening," he said during a community meeting. "This isn't what HOAs are supposed to be about. They're meant to protect property values and maintain community standards, not wage personal wars against private citizens." The most satisfying moment came when the HOA's lawyer, the same one who'd sent me that threatening letter about compliance violations, called to formally retract all previous claims against my property. He sounded nervous, probably worried about potential legal action, but I had no interest in pursuing that route. The community was already paying enough for Karen's mistakes. As the dust settled and summer turned to fall, life around my farm started returning to normal, but with some notable improvements. The HOA, under its new leadership, removed the landscaping that had been encroaching on my property, replacing it with a simple legal boundary marker. They also installed signs clearly marking where HOA territory ended and private property began, ensuring there would be no more misunderstandings about property lines. Karen, I heard, had put her house on the market and was planning to move to another state. Rumors circulated that she'd found another planned community to live in, though I couldn't help but wonder if they knew what they were getting into. Part of me wanted to warn them, but I figured some lessons people need to learn for themselves. The most unexpected outcome of this whole ordeal was the relationship that developed between me and my neighbors. The real neighbors, not the facade Karen had tried to maintain. Once they were free from her influence, many turned out to be genuine, friendly people who respected boundaries and actually understood what being a good neighbor really meant. Several residents even approached me about starting a community garden project, not on my property, but on a vacant lot within the HOA's boundaries. "We thought about what you've done with your farm," one neighbor explained, "and it inspired us to create something similar for our community, the right way, with proper permissions and planning." Looking back now, I realize this story is about more than just one power-hungry HOA president or one farmer fighting to protect his land. It's about the importance of standing up to bullies, no matter how well-dressed or well-spoken they might be. It's about the difference between real community values and the artificial ones someone tries to impose. Most importantly, it's about understanding that being a good neighbor doesn't mean controlling others. It means respecting boundaries and working together when both parties are willing. My farm is still my private sanctuary, my escape from the world. The gate is still locked, the cameras are still running, old habits die hard, and the no trespassing signs remain firmly in place. But now, when I look out over my fields toward the neighborhood in the distance, I no longer see it as a threat. Instead, I see a community that learned a valuable lesson about power, respect, and what it really means to be neighborly. The tomatoes I replanted after Karen's vandalism are flourishing now, better than ever. Sometimes I leave a basket of fresh vegetables by the HOA community center, my way of being a good neighbor on my own terms. And that, I think, is the real victory in all of this. The freedom to choose how we engage with our community, rather than having it forced upon us. A year has passed since the dust settled on what local papers dubbed the Great HOA Land Grab Scandal, and the ripples of what happened here have spread far beyond our little corner of the world. My story, it turns out, struck a chord with people across the country who'd faced similar situations with overreaching HOAs and power-hungry administrators. The changes that emerged from this conflict were more far-reaching than I could have imagined. The City Council, motivated by the public attention our case received, established new guidelines for HOA governance that have since been adopted by several neighboring communities. They created clear boundaries between HOA authority and private property rights, implemented transparent financial reporting requirements, and established an independent review board to handle disputes between HOAs and residents. Dave, who transitioned from interim to permanent HOA president, has been invited to speak at regional community management conferences about the importance of ethical leadership and proper governance. He often uses our story as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of community consent. What happened here, he tells audiences, wasn't just about one person's abuse of power. It was about a system that allowed that abuse to flourish. The audit of Karen's tenure as president revealed even more than we initially discovered. Beyond the unauthorized legal fees and surveying costs, they found evidence of selective enforcement of rules, personal vendettas carried out through fines and violations, and even attempts to manipulate property values through targeted harassment of certain homeowners. The findings led to a complete overhaul of the HOA's organizational structure. The new system they implemented is actually quite innovative. They created a rotating board membership to prevent any one person from accumulating too much power, established mandatory financial oversight committees, and implemented a resident-driven approval process for any major policy changes. They even created a community rights advocate position, a resident elected to represent homeowners in disputes with the board. But perhaps the most significant change came in the form of legal precedent. My case, though it never went to court, caught the attention of state legislators. They used it as a launching point for discussing broader reforms in HOA regulations. A bill is currently working its way through the state legislature that would establish clearer limitations on HOA authority and stronger protections for adjacent property owners. As for Karen, her story took an interesting turn. She did move away, as rumored, but her attempt to start fresh didn't quite go as planned. It turns out that in the age of social media and interconnected communities, reputations have a way of following people. The HOA in her new community received anonymous tips about her history, along with links to news articles about our conflict. They politely declined her application for their board of directors. I received an unexpected letter from her about 6 months after she left. It wasn't exactly an apology. Karen doesn't seem the type for direct admissions of wrongdoing. But it was revealing in its own way. She wrote about how she'd always seen herself as a protector of community values, someone who knew what was best for everyone. Perhaps, she admitted, I lost sight of the line between protection and control. The letter ended with a question that stuck with me. Do you think there's a way to maintain high community standards without becoming the very thing people fear? I never replied, but I think the answer lies in what our community has become in her absence. The HOA still maintains their standards, but they do it through cooperation rather than coercion. They've learned that true community values can't be enforced through threats and fines. They have to grow naturally from mutual respect and shared goals. The property values she was so concerned about, they've actually increased, partly because people are drawn to the idea of a well-maintained community that respects individual rights. My farm has become something of a local landmark, though not in the way Karen intended. People still admire it from the road, but now they do it with respect for private property. Some even point it out to visitors as a symbol of standing up for what's right. That's the farm that changed how HOAs work around here, they say. The old gate still stands, freshly painted and well-maintained, but it's no longer just a barrier. It's a boundary marker between private and public space, a reminder that good fences can indeed make good neighbors, especially when both sides respect what those fences represent. As I sit on my porch watching the sunset paint the sky over my fields, I can't help but reflect on everything that's happened and the lessons we've all learned. This story, which began as a simple dream of finding peace in a quiet place, evolved into something much larger, a testament to the power of standing firm in what you believe is right. The impact of our conflict extended far beyond property lines and legal documents. It sparked conversations about the nature of community itself. What does it mean to be a good neighbor? How do we balance individual rights with collective interests? Where do we draw the line between maintaining standards and imposing control? These aren't just abstract questions. They're at the heart of how we choose to live together in society. The answers we found here might seem simple. Respect boundaries, communicate honestly, and remember that true community can't be forced. But implementing these principles requires constant vigilance and commitment. The new HOA leadership has shown that it's possible to maintain high standards without resorting to intimidation and control. They've created a model that other communities are starting to emulate, one based on transparency, accountability, and genuine respect for both individual and collective rights. My relationship with the community has evolved in ways I never expected. While my property remains private, I've found ways to be part of the larger community on my own terms. The community garden project that some residents started has flourished, and occasionally they ask for my advice on farming techniques. I've even hosted a few educational workshops on sustainable agriculture, not on my property, but at the community center. The security cameras are still in place, and the no trespassing signs remain, but they no longer feel like defensive measures against hostile forces. They're simply part of the clear boundaries that allow for healthy relationships with my neighbors. As one resident put it, we learned that good communities are built on respect, not rules. Looking back, I realized that what Karen never understood was that community isn't something that can be enforced through regulations and fines. Real community grows organically when people feel secure in their rights and respected as individuals. It's built on trust, mutual respect, and the understanding that diversity, even in how we choose to live, can be a strength rather than a threat. The legacy of our conflict isn't just in the legal changes or new HOA policies. It's in the shift in mindset that occurred in our community and beyond. People realize that standing up to abuse of power isn't just about protecting yourself, it's about protecting the very essence of what makes communities work. As for me, I finally have the peace I was looking for when I bought this place, though not quite in the way I expected. There's a deeper satisfaction in knowing that my stand for private property rights helped create positive change for others. My farm isn't just my sanctuary anymore. It's a symbol of the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it would be easier to give in. The sun has nearly set now, casting long shadows across my fields. In the distance, I can see lights coming on in the homes of the HOA community. But unlike before, these lights don't represent a threat or a source of anxiety. They're just neighbors living their lives, respecting boundaries, and understanding that true community is built on choice, not coercion. And perhaps that's the greatest lesson in all of this. Sometimes the strongest communities are built not by forcing people together, but by respecting their right to stand apart. In the end, it's not about walls or gates or rules. It's about understanding that good neighbors aren't made by HOA regulations, but by the choices we make every day to respect each other's rights and dignity. That's a legacy worth protecting, one property line at a time.